Hey, good morning. All right, we're going to jump into second week, and we're going to kind of join week two and week three in a way. And I know we go through and we actually went through cells, the structure, functions, and then we jumped into communication in the cell cycle a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to take and join unit two, which we're going to cover this week, and then unit four we're going to cover next week, and then eventually we'll get to the unit three the week after that. And again, Friday we're going to learn more about which way the AP. The board is going to take these exams, and so we'll kind of have a little bit better idea as far as where we are going from here. But that's going to be the plan. So again, make sure you guys read in Google Classroom as far as what you guys need to be doing. All right, so we're going to start today. All right, we're going to kind of cover. I'm going to break this down into 4 videos as far as the cells and the cell structure. First one, we're just going to kind of talk basis of prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells, some of the major themes that we're going to kind of discuss during this unit, and some of those themes that really kind of hit hard throughout the course of the year. I think kind of as we go through, probably the biggest thing we need to obviously understand, and this is at a point, this is something you guys should know for the whole year. This guy's something you should know from regular bio. Is just simply the differences between the eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So when you look at cellular classification, you have obviously your classification of prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. You can break the eukaryotic cells down into plant versus animals, and from there. And so, and I'll dive into this more, but just make sure you guys are also understanding that even though we're talking about prokaryotic eukaryotic cells having, these different characteristics and these different functions, even within the human body itself, the eukaryotic cells can be different, just depending on the function, depending on what they're doing. And so, right off the bat, okay, as we go through, we're looking at obviously the difference between prokaryotic, eukaryotic cells, and a lot of things that come into play. We talk about prokaryotic cells first and foremost. Prokaryotic basically means before the nucleus, eukaryotic meaning a true nucleus. One of the big things there is we start looking at the eukaryotic cells have a true nucleus. They have membrane-bound organelles, much more complex, multicellular. And again, some of those bigger questions that you guys need to start asking yourself, and hopefully have throughout the course of the year, is just simply why. And so we talked in the past about why eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Why don't prokaryotic cells have a nucleus? And obviously you start looking at some evolutionary advantages. Prokaryotic cells allows them to go through the process of asexual reproduction, I think, much more regularly. Eukaryotic cells have much more control over their genes and gene expressions and the DNA itself, based on having the nucleus. And even though you look at the nucleus, or prokaryotic cells not having a nucleus, the DNA still is kind of balled up in a certain region. And so it just isn't a true nucleus, but yet they kind of have an area to where that DNA is going to be found. All right. So a lot of things that you're going to find that are relatively different between those two organisms, or two different types of cells, and mainly it's going to be that membrane-bound organelles. But there are also some things that they have that are the same. They got ribosomes. They've got there's chromosomes. Obviously, they've got the cytosol, which is the jelly substance that you find inside of it. They're both going to go through cell respiration. There's a lot of things that they also have that are the same. It's just you're looking at the complexity versus the simplicity of these two organisms. But again, both are basically capable of surviving in an environment and doing very, very well in there. So one of the major themes that we covered, and I think probably is a big part of this unit, is just going to be the overall the process of homeostasis, to where an organism obviously must maintain or does maintain a constant internal environment. And when you kind of look at the overall ability for the cells to do what they do, that's kind of what it's all about. It's all about the homeostatic capabilities, and basically the trying to maintain that internal environment and increase their likelihood of survival. And so when we look at homeostasis, we're going to talk cell transportation here at some point in time. We also just kind of start looking at the day-to-day regulation of what's going on within the cells themselves. All right, one of the major concepts that we bring up is going to be cell size, and kind of the big question comes up is, why do cells divide? Why don't they just keep growing and growing and growing? And obviously, based on the labs we did in bio, that's going to come down to the surface area to volume ratio. And if you guys remember the lab that we looked at, it basically was the agar cubes, and the more and more larger that the cells became, the less efficient they became, because eventually that material can't reach the inside of the cell as efficiently. So we talk about efficiency, we talk about homeostasis, we talk about surface area to volume ratio, and even then, we're not talking about just cells themselves. We're talking virtually any organism out there, any structure where we have an increase in surface area. We've got tiny little microvilli that you find on intestines. We've got microvilli that we're going to find on certain, I shouldn't say microvilli, but root hairs that you're going to find on plant roots, which increase surface area. And so, again, when you kind of look at just the overall kind of characteristics of a lot of these structures that we have inside of it, the surface area comes into play quite a bit, and we want to increase that surface area as much as we possibly can. That's going to make these not even just cells, but just the organisms and organelles much more efficient as time goes on. So we've got kind of that going on as far as some of the major themes as we're going to cover. Now, as we start breaking down, okay, remember again that we've got the prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells, but we've also got the differences between the plant and animal cells. And probably the biggest things that we're going to find, let's not even talk differences, talk similarities. They're all going to basically have the ability, plant versus animal. Obviously, the eukaryotic, so they have a cell membrane, right? They have a true nucleus. They're going to have the ability to produce proteins. So they're going to have some of those little endomembrane systems that we're going to talk about here in the next video and going on. But some of the biggest differences obviously are going to be just the general makeup of the cells themselves. And when you start looking at the difference between the plant and animals, a lot of this comes down to, again, just stationary versus locomotive organisms. And having to basically survive without being able to move, can still respond, but just not move, versus the animal cells being able to. And we kind of go back to some of the other characteristics of plant versus animals, the heterotrophic versus autotrophic. You go back to just how they feed and how they obtain their energy. So the biggest thing that we're going to find again between plant cells and animal cells, plant cells obviously are going to have the chloroplasts, the tiny green little structures that we find on the outside. They're going to have what we call plastids right here. There's plastids basically where you see sugar, water, coloration, right? Here's some plastids that are holding some starch grains. Large central vacuole on the inside, and want to absorb as much water as they possibly can, increases the turgor pressure within them and allows them to stand erect, to stand up tall. When you kind of start looking back at the plant versus animal cells, obviously a relatively dense nucleus, they have them. We just don't see them very well. The cytoplasm we find, or the cell membrane, on the outside, they have them. However, again, plant cells, nice, strong cell wall on the outside, which basically doesn't allow those plant cells to rupture when they're taking on such a high amount of water. And also even in the wintertime, it does aid a little bit in just the overall cell rupture when basically temperatures get down to the freezing point. And then obviously we're going to see the cytosol that we have on the inside of the cell membrane, which we do find in here as well. Now, I think probably one of the other biggest things that we need to understand is, as we start talking plant and animal cells, is that not every cell is created equal. And this will make more sense as we go on with the cell the cell parts. But when you start looking at these cells, that we always kind of categorize them as plant versus animal, and we've always in class talked about, well, animal cells have this and plant cells have this. And again, we need to understand that the cells that make up the human body, even though we contain the same DNA, obviously are having different functions. And so the different functions, is basically caused by different types of structures that you're going to find inside the cells. It's no different than the plants. You're going to find different cells that make up the xylem and the phloem versus those that make up the leaves, versus those that make up the fruit, and so on down the line. And so you wouldn't expect them to have the exact same type of characteristics and structures on the inside. And so kind of one of the biggest things that come up when we start looking at maybe plant cells, we start looking at chloroplasts. Well, are all plant cells going to have chloroplasts? Well, generally, no. If they're not green, they're not going to. When you start looking at the xylem and phloem, which are all about the major movement of food and water, throughout the plant itself, it's like their main focus isn't producing or taking in sunlight. So you're not going to have chloroplasts inside of there. Mitochondria. All right. One of probably the biggest things, misconceptions. We don't talk about this in our body all that much, or in our class all that much. But we take a look at red blood cells. Red blood cells lack mitochondria, and so it's kind of interesting to go back and take a look, because that's usually the cell that we think of most right off the bat is red blood cell. It's most common, but when you start looking at mitochondria, they're not there. And again, All right. One of and which is actually even more interesting is because they're carrying oxygen. So you look at what mitochondria actually does, and the red blood cells carrying oxygen. Well, what they do is they actually get rid of a lot of the organelles inside of their cells. So that way they can carry as much oxygen as they possibly can. And then again, the question comes up, well, how do they end up getting their energy? Well, remember, if they don't burn the oxygen, they just simply go through glycolysis in the case of just taking and burning glucose. So, I mean, you're going to find, different enzymes. You're going to find different structures in these cells, obviously just based on, their function or the overall job that they have. So keep that in consideration as you go on, that every cell is not created equally. You may find where an organism has a lot of mitochondria to where it's a highly energetic cell. You may find, again, organisms that have cilia and flagella where they need movement. And so, again, it just kind of varies. But biggest thing is that, I'm going to kind of cut this, wouldn't cut short, but just going to cut this short because I'm not going to run through all of these today. I think this is kind of something that you guys need to go through and just know the general basis of. Now, when we kind of start coming back, I think one of the major goals that we'll discuss, maybe we'll hit it right now. I think probably is just the overall ability for the cells to make proteins, and again, the proteins basically making the enzymes and that run that cell, traits and so on down the line. But remember that endomembrane system and the production of proteins, right? And how that comes into play. And so you've got, again, your rough endoplasmic reticulum, your endoplasmic reticulum, you get your Golgi bodies, you've got your ribosomes, you've got, the nucleus itself, you've got all these different parts that help and aid in the production of a protein. But then you've got these other little kickers like chloroplasts. You've got the cell wall that comes into play. You've got, vacuoles and lysosomes. What do they do for that overall process? So know these and kind of have an idea that, again, what they do for each cell, maybe even kind of get yourself in a little bit more in depth as far as what cells would maybe just kind of start thinking about, what kind of cells would have maybe more mitochondria, which ones would lack, and so on down the line. So I think that's kind of where we're going to cut it today. Obviously just knowing those basic structures, knowing the differences between the prokaryotic, eukaryotic cells, obviously taking into consideration the whole theme of homeostasis and also that surface area to volume ratio, just kind of what that means for cells and other structures out there. And I think what we'll do is we'll come back next time and I will hammer out the cell membrane. And I've got one for cell transport. And I think we're going to kind of finish up this unit and just a little bit of water potential. And you never know if we're going to get a question on that and make sure we can break down that equation and figure out what that means. So have a good day, everybody.